Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2. This is a compressed video of lesson 2 for the reason I've mentioned previously. This is for anyone that want to catch up on the missing lesson of lesson 2, and the assumption is that you should have your notes in front of you, and you may already have read the notes once or twice. I try to fit this into maybe a 30, 35, 40 minutes window. Sometimes it's hard. This one also mentioned about the assignment 1, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. This is totally for people that miss lesson 2. Okay. So the objective, we're going to talk about risk management concept, and we're going to talk about something called information security and risk framework, which is what the assignment is about. So I'm going to talk about what that is and what are some of the background informations, and also how you can develop and implement an information security and risk framework, or ISRF, in a real company. Okay. So I'm not going to do the recap of the lesson 1. So what is a framework? A framework is kind of like a skeleton, or kind of like a little, so if you see the pictures there, it's like when you build a building, you build a frame first, right? So you had the little frame before you put in all the meat, so to speak, right? So from a business point of view, the framework means it's a high level plan to make sure that the subject is consistent and the same quality can be maintained. So you talk about software frameworks. So for companies, it's going to make thousands and thousands of software, internal use or external use. Then you want to have a framework. So, different programmer come in to participate at different time in the development process will know that they have to stick with the framework. IT management framework is the same. So security framework is also the same. So I'm going to give you an example here. This is an example information security and risk management framework. As you can see from the diagram point of view, there are different boxes, and each boxes could be referred to as a set of processes. Okay, so you see that the center column has different processes around setting the risk appetite or risk tolerance, structure of risk management process or risk management structure within a company. And then it also talks about embedded risk into the governance process. And last but not least is supervise, monitor, and report risk. And you see on the left, on the right are, I don't know whether you can say it's a supporting process, but there are processes that are highly related all through the center processes. So you talk about organizational culture, which have effect on the risk appetite, the structure of risk management, the embedded governance processes, as well as monitoring and reporting risk. It's all part of the risk culture, right? I mean, the organizational culture. On the right side of the diagram, you see something called crisis management. When we talk about information security and risk management, there are inevitably something called crisis management. When something breaks, when something being breached, when something is being stolen, then the company dealing with that instance would inevitably run into something called crisis management. And as you can see here from the framework, all those lines, it's like, okay, the crisis management has to communicate between risk appetite, risk management, governance processes, as well as monitoring and reporting risk. So basically, I think the framework here, from a diagram point of view, is to show there are deep relationship between major processes in a company. And sometimes you see a one-directional arrow, meaning that something happened here and then it goes to the next one and then it goes to the next one and so on. But if you see arrows that are pointing both sides, meaning that they have a back and forth communications. So if we look at the text explanation here on the left hand side, it is the framework, information security and risk framework, is a series of documented processes that are used to define policies and procedures around the implementation and ongoing management of information security and risk management controls in an enterprise. Okay, so the framework is nothing really magical. It's basically a set of documented processes. It's not something that people kind of acknowledge that they will do. No, it's something that are documented. So processes in a company need to be documented because it is important to actually let people know these are processes, and now document the process also means that these documents are well thought out, being reviewed by appropriate people, and also by signing off by management and appropriate people, and it's officiated to be implemented. So a document process actually means a lot of things. So it's not like something you created, you write down on a paper and then consider it as a process. Documented process is something that the company actually acknowledge. And then the other thing that we talk about here is policies and procedures. Okay, security and risk management has a heavy note on policies and procedures. Actually, everything is. Even though IT management, project management, security management has a strong, heavy reliance on policies and procedures. Because if you don't have a policies, there's no direction there, right? So if it's not procedure, then people don't know what to do. So policy and procedures are closely related and closely dependent on one another. Okay, and the next bullet is defining directions, governance, strategies, and guidance for information security and risk management. So the underlying purpose of an information security and risk management framework, apart from this is a set of documented process being reviewed, being accepted and approved in the area of information security and risk management, all these documented process define direction, define governance, define strategy, and provide guidance for employees, for IT, for different business groups to follow from an information security and risk management standpoint. Okay? So let's go back to the basics a little bit. What is information security risk? An information security risk is any event that could result in compromising organizational information assets. We have talked about this in the first lesson, that information asset is key to the information for the organization. Okay, it's just as important as any other tangible assets. Okay, why? Because if any of the information assets are being unauthorized, used, lost, damaged, disclosed, or being modified, then it will affect the company objective, right? And the information security risk is pertaining to all those things we just talked about. Okay, and it might affect the company's profit, personal interest, political interest of individuals, groups, or other entities. Information security risk assessment, on the other hand, is an ongoing process of discovering, correcting, and preventing security problems. So, information security risk assessment is a business process developed to constantly assess, discover, and correct any and prevent any security risk or problems. Okay, so making sure that nobody plan any viruses, people are not coming through, through the network and try to penetrate to your network and steal information from the company. So the risk assessment process is an integral part of a risk management process. Risk assessment is part of risk management. Okay, it is designed to provide appropriate level of security for information system. Okay, so this slide kind of spell out a big piece of our certificate program in terms of information security risk and how risk should be dealt with, and what risk management is all about within the company's context. Okay, so let's cover some of the basics. Okay, you may or may not be already aware of some of these concepts about risk. Risk is something we refer to as the possibility of suffering loss or damage. Okay, so often we talked about maybe doing investment, so we're investing money in some stock market or something like that, so we're inevitably taking a risk of that investment, and there's a likelihood that our investment may suffer a loss or damage down the road because we don't know. Or I use this example in a class, is that we take an action like crossing the road without following the traffic sign, like jaywalking, right? So you're taking that action, but there is a risk that car come by very quickly without you seeing or recognizing, then you get hit, then you get you're hurt, right? There's also something potential future harm for something that you do today. or present action. So the investment would be something along that line, right? And I remember I used that other example in class, is that if you I don't know whether you love sushi or not, if you eat sushi, and some people can, and some people had a problem with raw food, right? So you might suffer some sort of stomach problem or diarrhea the next day because of the food that you ate, the sushi that you ate the previous night. So there's these things that you do, then you suffer future harm. So eating sushi can be risky as well. So in terms of talking about risk, they usually have three terminologies that you have to remember. The first thing is the likelihood. How likely, or the probability, that a threat will occur. Okay, so you're running across the road, okay, and how likely there will be a car that come in that you didn't see. Now, of course, if you're talking about a wide open road that you can see 100 meter over there, 100 meter over there, it will be very, very highly unlikely that you miss a car 100 meter away, fast through the road. So you're okay, right? So from a likelihood point of view, that's a low likelihood. But if you have stomach problem all the time and you're eating in a sushi restaurant and you see that the way that they prepare the food is actually not very hygienic at the back when you see it in the kitchen, then you're running into a high likelihood whatever you're doing now, eating this raw sushi, may end up having a bad effect on your stomach tomorrow. Okay, so it's a likelihood. The other thing is about impact. That's very important too. It's like, okay, I don't know how likelihood that the risk will occur or the threat will occur, but I have to understand what the impact is. So if I run across the road, a car that come along that I didn't see, what will be the impact? The impact is serious because the car hits you, it could be fatal. So the impact could be very significant. Like eating a sushi, it could be a medium, depending on whether you're close to a hospital or your past experience about stomach problem and so on. So the impact is the measurement of the loss or damage that occur when the threat is realized. So the threat is whether there's a car come out of the blue that you don't realize, or the food that you are eating actually had bad bacteria or some food poisoning virus that you can see. Okay, so the risk exposure will be a result of these two main factors, likelihood and impact. So it helps to measure the magnitude or scale of a risk. Okay, now when we talk about likelihood, we can further break it down into two things: threats and vulnerabilities. Threats and vulnerability. Threats are possible danger that could compromise the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information asset. Okay, so the threats could be, okay, because you didn't do any security check on your staff or workers that come in the door and work for you. Then your threat is that these staff could come in with a hidden agenda to try to commit fraud against the information asset that you have. Another threat is that you are prone to operate in a network environment without sufficient operate in a network environment whereby, in a country whereby it's very known to a lot of the hackers, very sophisticated hackers. Okay, that's a threat. All right, the threats could be malicious, meaning intentional, like a hacker, or accidental. So the workforce with very lack of training may make errors accidentally without them knowing, so that's unintentional. Okay, it could also be external or internal. Similarly, it could be external, some of the third parties that out there that are actually creating that threat, compared to internal, which is your employees or something like that, right? Another thing is about vulnerabilities. Vulnerability is yourself, like your system, a weakness in a system that will permit a threat to be realized. Okay, so in crossing the street, using that similar example that we use, your vulnerability is that you walk very slow, you can't really run, and you can't see too far, too clearly, because you didn't bring your glasses. So that's vulnerability. If you can't see and the weather is bad, and you walk very slowly, so that's all vulnerabilities that will make you more prone to the risk being realized, right? And so the explanation: weakness in a system that permit a threat to be realized, compromising the CIA. Critical vulnerabilities are flaws that can be exploited by the attacker with the correct tools or by the correct situation. So using the system and the company as an example, your vulnerability may be, okay, the IT team did not apply the virus prevention program regularly. So what that means, you know what it does today, right? So every week or every now and then, the IT team will apply those virus checking definition files to their database. So when they run it, they have the latest signature of the virus. Or I will use this example more. In reality, is that all these operating system, Microsoft Windows and Linux and whatnot, regularly will check whether they have vulnerability on the operating system, and then if they found one, they'll issue a patch for you in the IT team so that you can apply the patch to the operating system to get rid of that vulnerability they found. All right, the vulnerabilities, if unpatched, will actually be open up for the bad guys to exploit. It could be some port being open unnecessary, so that the bad guy know which port 58 or something to go in and be able to exploit and look at the files and actually put a virus there to damage your computer. Okay, so critical vulnerabilities are flaws that can be exploited by the attackers. Okay, so that's why if the information security team or the IT team is aware of any known vulnerability on their system or weakness on their system, they should do their best to get rid of them or patch them, eliminate those vulnerabilities as soon as they can. Okay, so from an impact level, usually we would have low, medium, high, or very low, very high, and so on. So basically, from a CIA level, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, you wanted to be able to measure if this is realized, whether the loss is limited, whether the loss is serious or catastrophic, right? And in reality, I think you need a little bit more than 3 levels in order, because you can't fit everything into 3 levels. Basically, that's the impact. Okay, so using this table or matrix, you probably be able to appreciate. So if we had probability on one side, impact on the other side, a low probability and a low impact will end up as a low, but a high probability and a high impact would definitely end up in a red, like a high. So for medium impact and high probability, it will still be a red, and similarly for medium and high, or medium probability and high impact, would be a high as well. But if you had a low probability but a high impact, it will become a medium. So this is something that probably you can appreciate how things are being distributed. Okay, now again, this is oversimplified, but at least you get a sense that, okay, if the probability is very high but then the impact is very low, okay, then the medium. So nothing really to worry about. Expanded it further into a 5x5 risk matrix, you start to appreciate that this is more realistic now. So you get a very low, medium, high, and very high. Similarly, for probability, there's a rare, which very unlikely, possible, probable, and highly probable. So same thing, a highly probable and a very high impact will end up in a red. Similarly, a rare and a very low would be a minor. And then you start to see how these fill out, right? So you will have more category now. You had severe, you had major, and you have moderate, and you had minor. Okay? Now, company, and the one thing that I do is that I wanted to put a number to it so that this can be understood from a quantitative point of view. All right, and it's easy. It's because it's 5 category. It's just 1 to 5 and 1 to 5, and when they two intersect, you just multiply it with one another. So a high probability and a very high probability and a very high impact, it will be 5 times 5, 25. So using that example, you can propagate a whole matrix, and then based on that, this is where the risk tolerance or the risk appetite comes in. Okay, in order for the executive to understand and appreciate how much risk they can take, you can just say, "Oh, tell me, executive, how much risk you can take." They can't tell you, right? But if you build a chart like that, and then you use a numerical number to represent the kind of risk that they are dealing with, okay? Then you ask the question, what number do you think that you can withstand or tolerate about the risk with this company between the number 1 to 25? Okay? So let's say they think through this and they say probably a 10. Anything at 10 and above, I don't think we wanted to take. But anything less than 10, we can take them. Okay. So with that number, you can actually draw a line here. 10, right? Over 12, right? 12 and 10. Okay? So you can draw a line with the orange and the red being something that you can tolerate. But anything underneath that line, like all the yellow and the green, is acceptable. So you don't have to do anything about it. Okay? Okay? So understood, right? So this is important to understand and for you to appreciate how you can bring your executive to a point they can understand, okay, this is my risk tolerance. I can do this if it's below that particular mark. Now, the challenge later on would be how you can represent that number. Now, we talk about the risk assessment, risk management process later on, but basically this is very important to appreciate from a level that, okay, if I wanted to make other people appreciate, understand, and agree with me, this is the way to go. We needed to use some tangible numbers so that it means something for our audience. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the type of risk that we have. So basically, I'm breaking it down into 6 types of risk. Okay? Technical risk. So we're talking about any technologies, any software, hardware functionality. Whether those are brand new technologies, those are difficult software, those are unproven hardware or something like that, then it will generate different level of technical risk. Okay? And those are technical, so you need a technical solution for those risks. The other one is called management risk. What that means is that the management that you have, not just project manager, not just IT management, but just management in general in your company, do they have enough sufficient management experience? Do they have a habit of doing planning, review, and so on? If the management are known to not doing planning, overlook data, don't do analysis, and very much lack of experience, then the management risk in this company, it's very high, right? You know what I mean, right? So that's management risk. Financial risk is more obvious, whether you have cash flow problem, you have budget problem, you have capital problem, you want to do this project, but you don't have sufficient funding, you still go ahead, sign contracts, then you have a lot of financial risk. Among you, if you're a PM, like a project manager, you understand what I'm talking about here, And then same thing for project risk, absolutely, right? If the project doesn't really have a good schedule or allocate resources before you start working, you just kind of wing it, and then you run into a lot of project risk. Product risk, on the other hand, is you produce product, is the product thoroughly tested? If the performance of the product is actually being reviewed and enhanced, how reliable is your product? Meaning that you might have a lot of product risk that you produce a product and it will never work, and that's the type of risk that you have to work the product people, the development people, the marketing people, and so on. Last but not least is something called a personnel risk. Okay. Personal risk, including staffing, insufficient staffing, training problem, experience problem. So if you have a workforce that poor training, no experience, then you had a very high personnel risk. But if you had a group of workers that have done this project many times, are very familiar with that particular product, software, and so on, then you have a much lower personnel risk. So a lot of these things are to some degree common sense, but it's important for you to appreciate them so that you know where you stand in a risk scale, right? Okay? And this quadrant, this is called a risk quadrant. It's a bit academic. I have to agree, but it's a good way of letting you appreciate where risk come from. There are strategic risk, there are hazard risk, there are operational risk, there are financial risk. Strategic and financial risk are considered as speculative risk. Speculative, okay, things that may not really realize. But hazard risk and operational risk is considered as pure risk. So basically, the risk quadrant is to kind of give you an idea where risk comes from, okay? And you don't have to if you're not want to train to be a risk person, then this is as far as we'll go, okay? Oh, okay. So actually, I don't want to miss that. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about risk management in different environments. So you may ask that, well, if I work in a bank, if I work in the government or the hospital, risk management done differently? The short answer to that is not really. The approach to managing risk is basically the same or very, very similar. The difference is the focus. The concern is different, right? For a government, reputation is the big key, right? They do things wanting to be re-elected. They don't want to be in a bad reputation, so they can't get re-elected the next time, right? Whereas for banking or any other private or for-profit organization, financial and profit would probably be the main goal. For a bank to manage risk is that, okay, I want to make sure that our money is not being stolen, our customer, the saving of the customers are not being compromised. So financial and profits are the key, okay, because they need to make sure that their stock is performing well, okay. And risk framework, it's something that we talked about defining how and what, like the direction, the governance and whatnot. Risk assessment would be the ability to quantify the risk. So knowing that we have talked about the threat and vulnerability become the likelihood, and then the impact, and then the risk exposure, right? So risk assessment is to not play around, but is to understand the different factors and how they would affect the risk. So that's what risk assessment is for. And we want to have a consistent risk assessment process, so that to the company, when we talk about the numbering that we use, the risk being 10, the risk being 9, is actually consistent, whether you're in this department, this project, or at this time. Okay, so and then of course there is risk management and risk treatment, which we'll talk about more detail. So this is a good diagram to show you the step-by-step process in a risk management process. So when you want to manage risk, the key is that you need to identify them. So you see identification being the first circle, okay? Once you have identified what risk we're talking about, then you start conducting analysis on the risk. When you want to analyze the risk, you basically want to look at what information you have from the threat, from the likelihood, from the vulnerability, and from the impact. So you have to get into those historical data and whatnot, right? And then you evaluate or rank the risk, okay? So once you analyze them, then you're in a much better position to evaluate the risk. And then after that, after you evaluate them, then your risk is actually a 10 or 11 or a 12. Then based on the example we use, that anything equal or higher than 10, you should do something about it. Then comes to the point called risk treatment. So we have to determine what to do with that risk, with the evaluation that we just obtained. Okay? And then after we treated the risk, the risk could be eliminated, it could be mitigated, or it could have still some residual risk. But that's when we start monitoring it and reviewing the risk in an ongoing basis. So let's talk a little bit about risk treatment. So how many ways can we actually deal with these risks? So basically, from our point of view, there's 4 different type of treatment for any risk. The first one is called avoidance. Okay, so this will eliminate the risk because we are withdrawing ourselves or not participating in that activity. So using the crossing the street situation, you want to avoid that risk, don't cross the street in jaywalk. Go to the nearest traffic light and cross it properly. Okay, so if you are maybe developing a new technology in using Bitcoin or something like that, and that's something very high risk, so you want to avoid them. So you can avoid them by, don't do that. Not yet. Maybe we don't do any Bitcoin stuff. We wait a few years until the technology being mature. So we avoid them completely. So we do something else. All right. So that's not unusual. People do that. The second one is called reduction. Okay. Reduction is the most common one, meaning that we are mitigating it. We may not be able to eliminate that to zero, but what we can do is that we can reduce it to a point that we can accept it. Remember the scale that we use, anything equal to 10 or larger of risk, then we can accept. So maybe we come with a 12, but we can do something to make sure it comes below 10. So it's like, now it's become a 7. So it's acceptable now. All right. The most common the most common approach is to apply risk reduction strategy or controls so that it will reduce the risk. Okay. Another one is to transfer the risk. There's two ways of doing that. So using the technology situation, the Bitcoin thing, instead of avoiding it, okay, we can actually say, since I don't want to carry those risks, I'm going to get a consulting, I'm going to get a cloud service, I'm going to get someone outside to help me to develop the Bitcoin technology. So the risk is being transferred. They are bearing the risk, either they are more experienced, they have done those before, so I only get the finished product. So I have much less risk. Or we purchase insurance. Sometimes it's applicable, sometimes it's not. By buying insurance, when there's any bad things happen, we get coverage. So we transfer the risk to the insurance company with a cost involved, right? So same thing, everything is about a price. There's a price in everything, right? So when you are outsourcing, you are buying insurance, you are using more money, perhaps, but you are getting a more lower risk return in return. So that's quite common, not unusual. And then there is the last one. It's called acceptance. Acceptance is choose to accept the risk and not do anything, okay, due to justifiable business reasons, or the benefit outweigh the risk, the cost. Okay, so I talk about you spend $2 million to mitigate a risk that's only cost you $500,000. So you choose to accept it, taking the risk. You take the risk. Now again, based on the risk tolerance scale that we talked about, if there is anything like a 4 or 3, then it's understandable that we don't do anything about it. We just accept the risk. Okay? So these are the 4 very legitimate, very valid risk treatment methods. Okay. So there are some industrial risk, standard risk management tools. You'll see these names again in the future. But basically these are tools that are common. You may have seen some of these before: threat risk assessment, privacy impact assessment, control gap assessment, and so on. Or you may not, that's okay. I want to spend 2 slides talk about governance for this course, and that's about all we're going to talk about is policies and procedures. Okay? When we talk about governance, we talk about policies and procedures, and we explained that earlier. Policies and procedures defined the expectation, the direction, okay, the guideline for the company. Okay, what people should do, what IT should do, how IT systems should behave, etc. Okay, policies and procedures should cover overarching area, user area, IT area, information system area, business area, etc., etc., etc. So policy development is actually a big deal. All right, because you can have a quite broad amount of policies to govern various parts of your organization with different results. Okay, you need to have some business policies to make sure when you engage a third party, these are the things that you have to do, or these are the things that you can do, you cannot do. When you have some information system policies, is what it's defined. Okay, if you're going to go out to a vendor and purchase some system, these are the things that a standard that you have to include in a contract. Okay, things like that, right? And policies should be reviewed and approved internally by the proper management team or governance. Okay, and policies should all often be reviewed and then if you are developing new policy, you have to transition from the old to the new one, and then you have to provide sufficient training and awareness for your staff, not just employees, but also IT guys, system developers, so that they know your new employees what is the new policy and standard expecting out of them. Okay, this is just kind of an example of a place that I've been to, and these are the type of policies that I was involved in developing some of these, and we had a team that actually developed all these policies from the ground up. So it was a very interesting project. So some overarching policies, kind of like enterprise information security policies, risk management policy, privacy policy, HR policy. So these are overarching that applies to everybody, under the company. Technical policies are mainly focused at IT, IS team, IS meaning information system, and the user level policies are all for users, normal regular workers, what they should do, what are acceptable, what are not acceptable, and so on. Okay, so the next I wanted to talk about is the NIST Standard 800-30. Okay, NIST stands for National Institute of Standard and Technology. This is a U.S. government department that developed and compile standards for all of the U.S. government institutions. Okay, but because of the thoroughness that they have, a lot of the private company also kind of reference to that and borrow some of their standards as well. So the one that we're looking at today is the SP 800-30 revision 1. Okay, and you can see the link there, and I'm not really asking you to kind of download and read them. It's a very substantial document, but at least if you want in the future, that's where you're gonna get a copy. This course will not dive too deep into risk management. This is the only time that we're going to talk about. But in the second or the third course, the course that core information security, governance, risk management, and compliance, we will come back and talk about this again. Okay, and information security involve a lot of risk management just by nature of the information security stuff. And but there are organizations that have different risk management team, but risk has to kind of go with information security. Now I'm not talking about investment risk and security risk and so on, like buying stocks and investment and so on. I'm not talking about those. Okay, so this is what it looked like. So basically what I wanted to do is to show you what the risk management process that NIST is talking about. There are 4 components of it: assess, frame, respond, and monitor. Similar to the framework diagram I illustrate way from the beginning, is that you see all these arrows, is that these are all interconnected. Okay, you almost see that each one of these is interconnected with one another. Each one of these risk management process. Okay, so risk assessment is a key component of a holistic organization-wide risk management process. Okay, and risk management process include these processes that are mentioned over here: assessing, framing, monitoring, and respond. And we're going to look at each one of them separately. Okay, so what is frame risk? Framing a risk, meaning you want to put risk in the proper context so the audience can understand. The risk by itself, like a technical risk, for example, by itself, without the context, is meaningless or is not useful. Okay, because you want to know, okay, if this technology fails, what is the implication to the company? Okay, then you wanted to frame the risk is that, okay, this technology is actually very important to the company because this is our competitive edge and so on. So the purpose of producing a risk management strategy that addresses how organizations intend to assess risk, respond risk, and monitor risk. So framing risk also involves some high-level planning as well. Okay, so the framework risk will also involve issuing or developing a risk management strategy to help the organization understand where the risk is and how risk should be evaluated within the company. Okay, the risk management strategy also establishes a foundation for managing risk and delineate the boundary of risk-based decision within the organization. You will see this term risk-based come up here and there. What we're talking about here is that we're not trying to do things out of the context. Is it to bring things into context is that we're making decisions based on risk. Okay, if this is below the risk tolerance level, then there are very little that we wanted to do about it. But if it's over, then we wanted to treat it appropriately. So that's how you frame the risk. Assess the risk. That's mostly what we're doing, is that we wanted to evaluate what is the threat to the organization from different level. What are the threats directed through the organization against other organization, nations, vulnerability, either is internal or external, the harm or adverse impact, the bad effect that may occur if the potential of the threat get exploited by the exploit the vulnerability, okay, and the likelihood that the harm will occur. Okay, so the end result is the determination of risk. That is a function of degree of harm and the likelihood of harm occurring. Risk is equal to impact times likelihood. So that's something that I mentioned about earlier. Okay, respond to risk is similar to the risk treatment that we have. Okay, so we determine that whether we want to avoid the risk, transfer the risk, reduce the risk, and then accepting the risk. So basically, respond to risk is the risk treatment. Okay, so after all that, you have framed the risk, you assess the risk, and then you decided how you're going to respond to it. Then comes the harder part. It's called monitor risk. Basically, we wanted to be able to have a continued understanding of the risk. Yeah, sure, we do an assessment this month, this week, but after this month, this week, the threat may change. The needs of the company may change. The objective of the company, of the business objective, may change. So you need to have a mechanism to continue monitoring the risk. I mean, because of the hacker, all of a sudden search, they wanted to do all that because it's a more popular one, or your company become high profile in the news, so all the bad guys are aware of you. They come to see whether they can get some profit out of you. So you need to monitor the risk from that perspective, whether the risk treatment, the risk response from previous time, the last time you do the assessment, is still sufficient. Okay, so you verify that planned risk response are implemented, okay, and whether the information security requirement, derived from and traceable from the company's mission statement, function, and maybe from the government and so on. So it's like a continual process of making sure the risk it's probably still under control, basically. So the NIST standard risk assessment is a step-by-step process for organization to prepare how to do risk assessment, to actually carrying out a risk assessment, and how to communicate the risk assessment results to the management, key people, and how to maintain the risk assessment over time. So that's monitoring. Okay. So as a result, as you can probably imagine right now, is that risk assessment is not a one-time activity. Risk assessment, in fact, is an ongoing activity. So in a sense that this is something that you need to appreciate, is that, yeah, sure, I did a risk assessment, in February this year, but 6 months in now, is it still the same? Am I still confident that the mitigating control still reduce the risk to the level that is acceptable to us? So it's almost standard now that in organization that risk assessment process is cyclical. Okay, you do, depending on the risk, again, risk-based decision, depending on the risk of that particular technology or business application. If it's a very high risk application because it involves a lot of financial money movement and so on, you may want to review the risk more frequently. Otherwise, people review risk standard like every year, even every 18 months. But again, depending on the risk, you may choose to do more frequent review, or again, depending on whether there's a major change in the software, major change in the risk climate, in the threat, in the vulnerability of your system. So there's a lot of factors that drive you to how frequent you want to do. But the key thing here is it is an ongoing process, and you should do the risk assessment again at a time that you think is necessary. Okay? Oftentimes you want to make that as a regular thing, like once a year, but if anything happened between that 12 months, you do that sooner. So jokingly saying that makes information security and risk professional a lot more indispensable, because they need us to do continual work. So it's not a one-time work. We come in, we finish doing something, and then we go home. They never see us again. No, it's an ongoing process. Okay, so what about the value? Okay, the risk assessment and its value. Changing nature, the changing nature of all these things, like the organization's mission, the threat, operational environment, information system, technologies, and so on. I talk about these. So the changing nature of those elements makes the risk assessment, continual risk assessment, a necessity. Okay, so this is important. The last bullet is risk assessment is a point-in-time snapshot. Okay, so you know that I'm going to I assess the risk at that point in time. Things will change after that. Okay, so this is the diagram that NIST has, and it resembles the things that we've seen at the very beginning. But basically, it tells the relationship between some ongoing processes and how processes drive one another, and so on. Okay, all right. So I'm going to share with you an example. Instead of drawing in a big, huge document, so basically you needed to have a objective and scope section describing your information security and risk framework. These are some of the typical statements. Okay, the objective of a typical information security and risk management framework is to provide a common language to understand and manage business technology risk. Okay, it assesses technology, both technology and business risk, to ensure controls are appropriate and proportional. Document and align policies and standards to demonstrate end-to-end regulatory compliance, especially if you work in an industry that have heavy regulatory compliance. Insurance, banking, they all have regulatory compliance requirement. Okay, applies to business application, end user applications, and any other technology asset that owned by the company. So these are typical statements that you can have. Of course, you can expand them. That should be mentioned in the scope and objective section, because these will tell people reading the information security framework that what this is about. And then you can use a good diagram to illustrate how information security and risk management are done within your company. So I'm sharing with you a real life situation here. This framework explains that risk need to be assessed, and then after risk is assessed, you need to select a proper control. So in this case, the risk treatment is to reduction. Okay, so select the proper control, and then once the control is selected and implemented, you need to verify. Well, verify maybe not right away, but maybe in a couple of months when the control has been properly implemented. Then the information security team should have a process to verify whether those controls in place, and then test those controls and see whether the controls are effective. And then once you have done that, meaning that you have ensured that the controls are working, then you start to monitor and report on those risks and the control, right? So you may do this in 2-3 months, and then another 9 months, like a year. Then you do this again to assess to see whether these controls are still effective, these controls are still applicable. It may not. So that's kind of a framework with all these sub-nooks that you can appreciate. And here are the area of the business risk statement. So you see that in this particular framework, in this particular company, they are interested in the privacy risk, confidentiality risk, fraud and theft risk, availability, third party, disaster recovery, data integrity, and regulatory compliance. So based on this risk and these process, risk assessment process, they would define the level of risk. Is it extensive? Is it major? Is it moderate? Is it minor? Or is it insignificant? Okay, so the result of the information security framework is constantly trying to assess whether that application, the technology, it's high, medium, or low. I mean, from an impact level, right? The higher the impact, the more control you needed to put in. Okay, and also from a technology risk management principle, there are 11. I think I thought it was 12. 11 technology risk management, and they are in the area principle of integration, consistency, proven appropriate technology, risk-based ownership, accountability, awareness, proactive prevention, escalation, mediation, integrity, compliance with law and regulation, and reassessment. So basically, these are the principles important for the reader to understand why we need to have the risk management process, is to make sure these principles are being adhered to from a company objective point of view. Okay, it's a bit high level, it's a bit detail, too much detail for you, but I just want to show this to you so that you can appreciate what a real life example looks like. Okay, and okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what would be usual challenges if you want to implement an information security and risk management framework. Is that you need to get senior management buy-in or support. You can't just lock yourself in a room and come up with a process and a framework that your senior management is not supporting. That is not going to be implementable. Okay, different departments, especially the ones that get affected, will need to be adopting the framework. So this is the challenge. You want to make sure that all department is adopting the framework. In order to have that done, you have to make sure that the most senior level, it's buy-in. Once they bought in, then it's easier for them to kind of sell it down the chain. So the department will say, okay, since my CEO is approving this, is asking us to comply, then it's much easier for me to work with the information security team to implement that framework, right? And the risk framework affects more than just IT. So it affects business process, it affects purchasing, it affects marketing, it affects the user, and it affects everybody. And then it also is important to have awareness and training, because it is an ongoing thing. You got new employees coming in, and you got people changing roles and so on. So awareness and training has to be ongoing, so people get reminded of how risks are being done, how securities are being managed, and information are being protected, and they're being trained to use different tools that's available to them, and how they should be reporting the risk if there's an instance, and so on. And at times, if necessary, you get some outside help to come in, either to help you to do the training, to help you to do kind of a assessment as to how effective this information security and risk management framework is for the company. Often you do the big company, you get the big 3, big 5, whatever the consulting company like Deloitte, KPMG, and so on. They come in and spend a few weeks and charge you a big amount of money and try to give you a report card, right? That's what the senior management like to see, is that a report card. Are we doing the right thing for information security and risk? Is the framework working? I mean, is the employees actually aware of what you wanted to promote and so on? So that's a good thing to do. So these are the challenges, okay? And when you are developing and implementing an ISRF, some of the things that you need to be considering is that whether the ISRF, the Information Security and Risk Framework, supports the mission of the business. Just like anything else, it has to support the mission of the business. And you want to know who you want to get involved, okay? Don't just the IT department, don't just yourself. You want to get some of the key players, like champions, right? You want to get some of the right players to get involved right at the beginning, so they feel they are part of the program. They feel they are part of the framework. So it's easier if you roll them out in the future. And when you design it, you already think ahead. What is your rollout and implementation strategy? Okay? And you want to think of the potential challenges that I mentioned earlier, whether those apply to you or you have more ahead of time. So when you do the rollout, you know what to avoid and how to actually deal with some of those potential obstacles. Okay. So the tip of the day here is slightly different with what we talk about. I just want to identify the online identity is actually very important. bad guys are trying to steal your identity and using different social media, social engineering or anything. So you should look at your privacy settings. You should look at your social medias. Are you telling people information that are unnecessary through your Facebook, telling people you are, I often talk about these, right? You think you're telling only your friends in Facebook that you're going on a 3 weeks vacation, but other people may have a look at your Facebook knowing that you won't be home. Then they'll come and break in your home and something like that, which is possible. Now you may not think that they don't know where you live, but you may have a picture in your Facebook or your Instagram already telling people where and which area you are. I mean, which car you drive. I mean, it's like when the bad guys spend enough time, they're experienced and sophisticated enough that you're just opening up yourself. I'm not bashing social media, but I'm just saying that you need to be careful. Okay, so I'm going to explain the assignment 1 very quickly here. You already had the assignment. The assignment basically is to ask you to develop a strategy for a fictitious organization called Ontario Community Care and Support Centers. I'm not asking you to develop the actual framework, but a strategy of how to develop a framework and implement the framework. Just a strategy, like a high-level plan. Okay? And so these are some of the backgrounds. There are 150 community care and support centers all through Ontario, across the 14 health regions. And they do things that are authorized by OHIP, so they get funding from the government. But there are also services that they provide for Ontarians that are not funded by the government. So Ontarians pay for it, like meals on wheel or meal delivery, or handicap transit or so on, right? And so this is the 14 health region. It doesn't matter where they are, but at least they're geographically dispersed. And so these are the things that CCSC are offering from a service or standpoint. They do collect personal health information, which is sensitive information. They do communicate about them among their stakeholders. The stakeholders could be in physicians, hospitals, normal workers, social workers, and so on. Okay, so the structure of these organizations are there's board of directors for all of the CCACs. They have management team in each health regions. There's also an organization called Association of Ontario CCSCs, supporting IT, privacy, and security for all CCSCs. So the audience of this project, of this assignment, is for the AO CCSCs. It's for their team to understand how they can implement, design, develop, and implement a information security and risk framework for all of the CCACs in Ontario, CCSCs in Ontario. Okay, 200 employees, 2,000 employees, 150 CCSCs. Okay, so the strategy I'm asking you to do is to define the purpose and objective of the framework. What needs to be included in this framework, maybe like a table of content. Who should be involved in the development process? How the ISRF should be designed, developed, and implement, and any potential challenges and how you will overcome them. It's a group assignment. A 15-minute presentation would be due on the day that we come back. I think it's on the 23rd. And a PowerPoint presentation of that presentation should be handed to me. Okay, so this is the marking scheme. Okay, there are points for extras, but basically, in answering my questions, you get 40. Okay, a good, clear presentation, PowerPoint content, and the actual presentation will get you to about 70. Okay, and making sure you show them demonstration of collaboration, not just one person. That's another 10 marks. Okay, that's it. So hopefully this is useful to you, and I'll see you in the lecture.